falls under what we call Governance, Peace and Justice Commission. And so DLGF, in brief, without really taking much of our time, because 1 hour isn't really much, it's an all-sector network of influential Christian executives and societal leaders whose agenda is driven by issues affecting society that are identified through 7 gates. And one of that gate is the business and economics gate. So you agree with me that the matter we are looking at this evening, that's in our economy, and inflation, it's a matter that is affecting Malawi, and therefore all of us, not only those in the business gate, everybody, all the 7 gates, the church gate, the government gate, the health science and technology gate, the family and education, sports and arts and entertainment, media and communication, all of us are getting affected. All of us could get affected by issues of inflation, issues of economy. And so we are excited. We are looking forward to this moment to hear from our panelists. And we know that time is not enough, but we trust that this will stir people's hearts and people's appetites, and that perhaps in due course there can be a follow-up meeting, or maybe others may want to get some personal clarification on such issues. And so with those few remarks, without really eating into the time that we have at hand, I would like, on behalf of the General Overseer, to welcome all of us to this event. And please, let's feel free, let's ask questions, let's listen attentively. Thank you so much once again. Over to you, C. Ngalande. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director. And what we'll do is we'll get straight into the presentations. Briefly, I'll introduce our panelists, but they will be able to explain more about themselves. We have CA Lawrence Dururu. I'm smiling because I should have started with the lady. So perhaps I should talk about that first. We have got Dr. Bertha Chikadza, and she is the president of ECAMA and a seasoned economist, and she will set the ball rolling in our discussion tonight. She will set the stage about where we are as an economy, and then we will move on. We have a few last-minute changes and developments. We will be joined by Mr. Ferry Kamota, all the way from Zimbabwe. He will chip in around the experiences of a hyperinflationary economy, together with CA Dururu. So CA Ferry Kamota, he's an audit partner in Zimbabwe. We've worked together for long in PwC, and so it was good for you to honor our invitation. And then we have got CA Lawrence Dururu. He is the chairperson of the Technical Standards Committee of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Malawi. And so you'll be with me, CA Moffat Ngalande, and I'll be taking you through and moderating the session. Again, I would like to thank you for honoring the invitation. We believe that you will benefit. And so to set the scene, I will ask Dr. Bertha if you can start the presentation, and we'll allow you to present in the webinar. Thank you. So perhaps you can also just raise your hand so that I can unmute I can enable your mic, but I think as presenters, you should be able automatically to unmute your mics. So your mic has been enabled. You may unmute it. Thank you. Dr. Bertha, if you are talking, you should just check the mic. So let me just confirm. You can type in the chat box if you can hear me, if you're having challenges to unmute. All right, so I think while she sets up, we can move on to CA Lawrence Dururu. Chair, if you could come in to just set the ball rolling around the experiences in a hyperinflationary economy. And then I will ask us, our colleague Ferry Kamota to also just share some of the experiences that he may wish to share. Thank you. So, Sedururu, you can just raise your hand so that I can just unmute your mic. Thank you. Yes, you should be able to present.
Thank you, President. CA Mofat Ngalande. Of course, the title of President will not pass since you were President of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Malawi. And greetings to the leadership of the DLGF. And I would like to express my gratitude for creating this opportunity for us to deliberate, to discuss, and hopefully we can come up with something that is tangible and hopefully can be carried on to the relevant sectors of the economy to discuss how we can obviously contribute to the prospects of the Malawi economy. My name is Lawrence Dororo. Originally from Zimbabwe. I left Zimbabwe a few decades ago. Basically, you could say part of the reasons that drove such kind of movement was the scourge of hyperinflation. So it is quite painful to live through. I'll share some of the experiences that I remember going through. And I'm happy to hear that there is a colleague from joining us from Zimbabwe who also add on to some of the experiences. I'm going to share some of the experiences as I remember them, and some of them occur at very high levels of inflation, basically very strict levels of hyperinflation. And we, as we will see, and as we do, we will notice that maybe some of these are not yet prevalent in the Malawian economy. But suffice it to say that anything that goes unchecked can eventually spiral out of control, which I think is probably the reason why we're having this discussion. So a few things I can note is that investments in instruments like government bonds, treasury bills, particularly over any period, 6 months, 1 year, would completely disappeared. Okay, so yes, government would attempt to do anything, but there would basically be no interest. Planning in organizations, in organizations, people's lives became meaningless. Okay, organizations would basically be worried more about pricing, both today's pricing and tomorrow's pricing. And this is one factor I think participants should note about hyperinflation. The objective of setting up a business is to make sure that if you're able to buy and resell 5 units today, your business is only growing if after you have transacted, you're able to buy and resell 7 units. And we can all appreciate that in hyperinflation, it's very easy for you to be able to transact today 5 units and tomorrow to be able to transact none, which means basically your business is gone. So when you are looking at pricing, you are basically trying to speculate how long it will take for you to sell the products, how long it will take for you to source the replacement, and at what prices that will be, and then add a profit on top of that. So you price today for your ability to replace those items tomorrow or the 3rd day after and still make a profit. And when you replace them, you go through the same process again, and you can all understand how tedious that can be. Wallets, as we know them, when I came to Malawi, I wasn't carrying a wallet. The wallet became a symbol of nostalgia. So people carried them because they were used to carrying them. But they could not hold any money of value, of course, unless you had foreign currency, in which case that would be maybe we're just a few percentage of the population. So the wallets were not big enough to carry the amount of money that you needed to transact, even if it was to buy bread. So backpacks, bags that you would normally put clothes in, became a means of carrying cash for transactions. Now, part of this was compounded by the fact that banking systems basically kind of collapsed. There were shortages of cash. You get paid, you go to the bank. If you wanted to withdraw 10 million, the teller will tell you there is no cash. But if you add a million on your transaction, I can give you. So you withdraw 11 million, you get 10 million, and you quickly rush to the shops to buy whatever you need for the month. There was also a lot of organizations who organized paying a portion of the salaries for their employees in groceries, common groceries you find or need in homes on a day-to-day basis. It was common to find that remuneration was made partly that way, but you also needed cash to transact, to move around, like get on a bus to go to work and so forth. So that was also needed. So the cash didn't disappear constantly. So you had constant wage adjustments. These are wage adjustments were practically indexed on a more frequent basis. If you needed to make a payment for labor, it was if you wanted to get casual laborers, for example, you agree on an initial rate and you also agree on an indexation rate at the same time, because by the time that they might finish the tasks that they are assigned, things would have changed. You also started seeing lots of zeros on any numbers, and accounting fields or number fields within accounting systems, including banking systems, could not take such huge numbers. Banks had to adjust very quickly to these changing environments. Later on, the government tended to start rebasing the currencies as they were going, but after rebasing the currency, it will come back quite quickly. So financial statements would be presented in rounded numbers. That was always the case. You had to round the numbers because the accounting systems could not cope with what was happening. As I've mentioned, there was access to cash was impossible, virtually impossible. And there was very strict regulation around the uses or availability of foreign currency within the economy, and also regulations around pricing of commodities. But wherever you went, whether it was in a shop, whether it was on the street, buying some fresh vegetables, buying some cigarettes, buying everything you could find on the street, it was all based in foreign currency, and people developed the ability to switch from one currency to the other on a day-to-day basis. And this was the norm of almost every person who needed to do a transaction. They talked in foreign currency, and of course, I mean, not everyone had foreign currency. So you had to find a rate, exchange the rate at that time. And what was more difficult is change. Okay, so even in the local currency, change was very difficult. So they would keep a few sweets here and there so that you get, and in the minibuses, that was also common. Because once you convert and you subtract, you can't get the denominations that you need to be able to pay that change appropriately. So you get sweets, maybe 2, maybe 3, and so forth, just to compensate for that change. Yeah, so these are some of the day-to-day experiences, and you found it with every person you encountered. This was not restricted to companies. This was not just the behavior of people whose objective was to make profits, but even people who needed to survive. This was common. So I think this is my best recollections. Of course, being an economy, there are lots of things, and if you also go around and look at what was happening in other hyperinflationary economies, you will see common behaviors. Thank you, CA Moffat. Thank you, President.
Thank you very much. I'll then request Mr. Ferry Kamota, if you could also just come in just to give us some of the broader issues around central bank controls that have been put in place so far, and how that is going on, and so that we can just have an understanding of the concept of money and also how that is working in the country, and also just the journey from when there was the declaration or announcement of hyperinflation and how measures have been taken to curb that so far. Thank you.
Thank you, President Moffat. Unfortunately, I'm based here in Zimbabwe, and I will simply say all protocol observed because I don't know who is who in this meeting. So all protocol observed. Basically, Lawrence, I've touched almost virtually everything that happened during the hyperinflation at times. But I want to say for Zim, we have been through inflationary economy twice. First time in 2008, and then we dollarized at the end of 2008 to 2008, beginning of 2009. then started using US dollar as our currency. After the 2013 elections, then the US dollar started disappearing from the system. At the time of the coup, or the change of government, to put it politically correct, at the time of the change of government in 2017, they shortly after introduced Zim dollar again, and shortly after we went back into hyperinflation again. So we have been in hyperinflation twice. One thing which Lawrence didn't touch on, which is dear to my heart as someone who is aging, is the erosion of patience. We lost our patience twice. First time in ZWL, Zimbabwean dollar, and second time we lost our patience that we have contributed in US dollars. Because when the government changed from US dollars to Zimbabwean dollars again in 2019, they just said whatever was in US dollar is now Zimbabwean dollar at 1-to-1. And then the next morning, the Zimbabwean dollar was devalued to 1:2.5, and then devalued and continued on a downward spiral up to now, where they had to change the currency again. So basically, in this year, to answer what the president have asked, this year the government, from January to April, our dollar has fallen down by almost, is it 4,000% or 400%? I can't remember the exact percentage. That's when they started to introduce the new currency called Zimbabwe gold. We had a debate as chartered accountants whether Zimbabwe gold is a new currency or is the old currency that have been removed zeros. So the debate, we ended up saying, let's just leave it for now and see if it will also be subject to hyperinflationary challenges that the Zimbabwean dollar have been facing. The dollar was stable. One of the things that the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe did was to make sure it's not available in the public domain. You hardly see it, although you can transact it electronically, but even the electronics, it's limited electronically. So they made a shortage. However, we had the SADC summit in August, and in preparation for the SADC summit, they started printing money again. And it went up 3 times, and then the new currency lost the value by 43%. And then the policy which the Reserve Bank is trying to put in place, which have actually stabilized the first time, then was destabilized during the SADC. The preparation for the SADC summit was, they are saying it's backed by gold and foreign currency. When it's about to lose its value, they inject more US dollars into the market. That's the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. That's what they did the first time, and that's what they did this time around. They first devalued it and then inject additional US dollars into the market. Because it loses value because of the law of supply and demand, where the supply of the foreign currency is short supply, and then the demand for it is high, and then it loses value. So they actually try to fix the supply side. So basically, that's what they've been doing to maintain its value since they introduced the new currency, but it lost the value by 43% since its introduction. And they also say it's backed by gold, although I don't know exactly what that means, being an accountant, not an economist. But they've managed to stabilize the new currency so far, although when they started printing, that's when it lost the value by 43%. So basically, we've got the Monetary Policy Committee that meets every quarter of the Reserve Bank. Mainly, it's made up of economists. And I remember the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Zimbabwe used to have a representative in there as well. The president would join, but mainly most of them are economists. So they meet and then they just look at what could be happening in the economy, how best can they resolve the issues. But in looking at the overall economy of Zim right now, it's 80 to 90% US dollar economy. and only 10 to 15% Zimbabwe gold, the new currency. So basically, it's the US dollar that is driving the economy, including even the government spending. Although they did the budget in Zimbabwe in Zim gold, but basically it's 85% US dollar economy. As Moffat put it earlier, that I'm a partner in an auditing firm. We started a new auditing firm last year, and we've been around for about a year now. I've never done any transactions with my firm in Zimbabwean dollars. Everything that we do it in US dollars. That's how our economy is like at the present moment. I'm ready to answer any questions, Mr. President, if there are any.
Thank you very much. So thanks so much for the background. We'll then just ask for Dr. Chikadza if she can present, and then we'll get the questions after that. So where we have a question, let's type in the chat box so that we can see what questions are coming. Thank you so much. Dr. Chikadza, you can just confirm, you can just raise your hand in case I need to assist with unmuting, but I've already unmuted you. Yeah, you seem to be connected on 2 devices, so I've enabled the second device as well. Actually, 3 devices. So just see whether you can unmute yourself, and then you should be able to be audible. Right, yes. So you should be able to unmute your mic because it's now enabled.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you, but I cannot share, so I don't know if that part is also controlled by that side.
No, it could be just a connectivity issue. I'll send you a text that you can proceed because we can hear you clearly.
Okay. Okay, so this means I can just speak.
If you have
or probably you can
presentation,
share
you
from that
can project.
side.
Yes.
I
You
have the
can send to me.
presentation, but Okay. Mhm.
Right. So I think as she's setting up, I would like to just ask regarding the changes of currency, perhaps to Ferry. You can just confirm what, in your view, was causing this challenge to say changing from one currency to the other. You have talked about the monetary policy that was there, but perhaps you can also advise regarding the underlying issue, why there was no confidence in the currency. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. The challenge which the people faced, which was highlighted by Mr. Dururu earlier on, where people lost everything that they had, all their savings, their pensions, and everything that were held in monetary values, lost value. So people are now skeptical of the return of Zimbabwean dollar. When the government said they are going to introduce the Zimbabwean dollar in 2019, the next minute, virtually everyone stopped trading. Not really sure what was going to happen next, because no one had the confidence in the Zimbabwean dollar because of what has happened in the past, where everyone have got bent fingers and is saying we might get bent again. So people feel that having whatever they have in their savings, be it pension or savings, whatever, in US dollar will maintain value as opposed to Zimbabwean dollar. And that proved to be true as well, because 6 months later, that was 3 months later, they introduced the Zimbabwean dollar in February. By July, we're already back into hyperinflation. They say cumulative for the past 3 years should be 100%, but within 3 months, we had already reached 100% inflation, and we're back in the hyperinflation. So people are naturally skeptical on using the Zimbabwean dollar. They don't have confidence because of what happened in 2008. Even up to now, even after the introduction of the new currency called Zimbabwean gold, and these guys say it's backed by gold and backed by foreign currency reserves, and they are doing their best to instill confidence, but still no one is prepared to have his savings or whatever in Zimbabwean dollars. One would rather buy land and have that land to retain its value than to keep your money in the bank in Zimbabwean dollars.
All right.
So
No,
that's where our challenge is as a country.
all right. No, thank you so much. So I think we can then just proceed. So I see a hand from Sia Dururu. Is that the old hand or a new one?
Yeah, it's a new one.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, President. I wanted to add to say that once you get into a hyperinflationary environment, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, much of the value of a currency depends on the confidence of the people in that currency. So what you find in Zimbabwe, and we need to guard against that, is that government, yes, has got the authority to make policy and to make laws. But people react to those laws. Part of what is happening, and I think will continue to happen as it is that the government is proved to have a tendency of putting in legislation that basically leaves a lot of people at a loss. Now, the difference between the US dollar and the Zimbabwean dollar as currencies, or the Zimbabwe currency and foreign currencies, is that the Zimbabwean government has control over the local currency, but there's no control over a foreign currency. So because they have no control over a foreign currency, they are unable to influence it. Now, once the government says we are going back to Zimbabwean dollars, everyone looks at it and starts speculating, because much of it is the behavior of people, the behavior of business. Everyone wants to safeguard themselves. They want to safeguard their assets. So the moment they say Zimbabwean dollar, convert everything, everyone starts anticipating all these changes and starts increasing prices. Because at the end of the day, it's how the prices move that is going to create a situation of hyperinflation. As we will talk later, and as we will see that this is probably what is 80 to 90% of what is happening in Malawi. And this is exactly what keeps the hyperinflation in Zimbabwe going. The people cannot believe that the government will desist from putting legislations that will make them lose. And because of that, they are going to speculate, they are going to safeguard themselves by anticipating that loss in value and make sure that what you get today will cover you for the loss that you're anticipating tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Dr. Tigadza, you can now proceed with the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'd like to say it's something that I've just put in together. As you know, the time was limited, but I just talk about, the brief analysis, for example, the nature and state of our economy. So I just keep the outline and let's proceed to slide number 4. All right, so basically, I'm just highlighting Africa's macroeconomic performance. I would have loved if I was sharing, because here I also had another figure from the Reserve Bank publications where they were showing that indeed the African Development Bank and the World Bank, both in 2023 and early 2024, were showing that Africa was actually, slowly reactivating in terms of growth. However, they also stipulated that there are headwinds that are remaining, saying that Africa is not yet out of the woods. And this has actually been shown in the figure that I would have loved to show, but because I'm unable to show, and it's showing how inflation is high, not just in Malawi, but in Nigeria and other African countries, for example, Mozambique, and so many others that we can see, I think, in Angola, and so on and so forth. But even though Africa is experiencing this globally, inflation is going down. And this has also been shown as the effect of tightening of monetary policy across the globe. Let's move on to the next slide. The next slide, please. All right. So here I was just trying to highlight, the macroeconomic performance in the country, such the way that, sorry, the previous slide, such the way that if we are to look closely, the first graph to the left is showing the forecast for 2024 up to 2026. And this was actually, I think, last year when we were showing that inflation is going to slow down, and so growth is going to be around there about maybe 3.8%, but then it was revised to 1.8% in 2024, as you can see. However, the projections as they were saying next year we are going to grow by 4%, which we're seeing that is not actually true, but we might grow above what we have grown this year. So this year we've suffered a lot in such a way that we are anticipating some positive benefits next year if we have something from mega farm, but also maybe good rains. But if you can see on the right slide, we also have some issues with the fiscus in such a way that we've seen domestic debt rising, the yellow part, and we've also seen external debt, rising, and the fiscal balance has also been seen as not doing well. So if we are to see the macroeconomic performance in general, the economy hasn't been performing well in terms of domestic revenue, which is actually driving the external and the domestic debt, because we are actually incurring a fiscal balance all the time. Let's proceed to the next slide, please. And from what we can see, inflation has also remained high. So from around 2020, our inflation was around maybe 9.8 thereabout, and then it jumped, to about 20% around 2022, going up all the way to this year, where we are talking about, I think, around 32 point something percent. And this has actually come about because of the things that we are seeing in terms of maize prices going up. But even though we can see that in 2024 inflation is high, 2025 inflation is projected to fall down probably to 24.2%, and thereabout maybe 2026 to 17%, according to these projections by, say, IMF, which are projecting around 15%, the World Bank 27.3%, and we also have a projection by Bridge Capital and also in Economics Intelligence and so on and so forth. So there are so many projections which are telling us that inflation is going to go down, looking at how maize availability is proceeding in terms of distribution, but also making sure that even those who do not have food are actually having food. So this is going to drive down the overall inflation. Proceeding to the next slide is that if we can see in terms of GDP growth, the next slide, please. We've also seen that growth remained subdued. If we look from 2022, then the other slide, the previous slide, please. 2022 growth remained subdued, going all to 2023, 2024. And remember, we are coming from COVID, and then we met all these problems with our with the things that we bet in terms of climate challenges. So we had, for example, Cyclone Freddy, Cyclone Anna, and all other cyclones, and these have been affecting us a lot in such a way that if we look that forex availability, the challenges continued. So as an import dominated country, the red part that we are seeing are all our imports. And the blue part is just the exports, and the yellow part is the trade balance, which is the difference between the imports and exports. So because our growth remained subdued, it means that we were not actually producing enough so that we couldn't export as much as we were supposed to export. And we were unable even to cover all our imports. And so as we can see, the imports are actually growing larger and larger up to August of 2024, while our exports are actually minimal. And this is actually also contributing to large trade balances. And so all we are trying to lay down is a foundation of where we're coming from, because these are also putting pressure on our currency. When we are importing a lot than what we're exporting, and this is an import dominated country, so we are importing a lot in terms of whether it's agricultural imports, in terms of maybe just food items and anything. We are actually putting pressure on the currency, and this is making the currency to lose value because we are not generating enough to cater for all our imports. And the next slide is just showing that our problems have always come from climate. So, for example, this year we were hit by drought. If we can see, it's not just Malawi that was hit by these high temperatures, which are above, 40, 50% of the normal. So we had even Zambia that experienced the same. We had Zimbabwe, we had Mozambique, and Tanzania was just briefly touched. So in Tanzania, things were okay, but probably because of preparation, our colleagues in Zambia were able to stabilize the situation much better than us, in such a way that we ended up being badly hit by the drought that we faced this year. And we were also coming from a devastating cyclone last year, which also reduced, a part of our productivity, agricultural productivity per se. Let's proceed to the next slide. And if we are to look at how this productivity has affected the country, so this is a country which inflation is basically driven by food items, because we actually depend highly on maize production, and we eat, a lot of maize. And so we noted that, I think initially it was estimated that the deficit would be around to 16%. Then there about, I think around April or May, then the deficit manifested that it was more than 16%. And as a country, we require 3.5 million metric tons of maize, but our production was about 2.7 million metric tons. And we had this deficit, which is the red part of the pie chart. And if we are to look even at the maize prices, comparing the prices from last year to this year, the green dots on the right hand side are just showing the prices of maize in different locations of the country last year and this year. So the red part, you can actually see that this year's prices have been higher than last year's prices in almost all regions, except maybe in the northern part, where in some areas you could see that I think the prices were not changing much. For example, in Mzimba, Jenda, Mzuzu, and so on. But Chitipa prices were actually a bit higher, and in Zuzu, prices were higher. In the central region, they were totally different from last year's prices, and the southern region, the same, are very different. So this has actually affected a lot and contributed a lot in terms of the change in the level of prices. If we go to the next slide, we are also seeing that just as Malawi was a bit slow, probably in reacting to the lack of availability of food as compared to Zambia and also other countries, we can see that even the maize prices in Malawi, if you were to compare them maybe with Mozambique, South Africa, Tanzania, Zambia, and also Zimbabwe, maize prices in Malawi were actually higher. You know, a bag of maize, which is weighing, say, 50 kgs, was about 43,500, while in Zimbabwe, the same was costing 36,000. And in Mozambique, it was around 31,000, and South Africa, it was around 26,000. So as you can see that prices in Malawi this year in terms of maize, which is our staple food, were actually much, much more higher. And one thing that I think we have to keep on seeing is that inflation indeed remained elevated in the country just because food inflation dominated. And the next slide is just showing us how food inflation contributes in the inflation basket, which is the consumer price index that, you know, forms the baseline inflation or headline inflation of the country. So if we can see that at least non-food inflation wasn't rising much, because if you look at the graph on the right, non-food inflation was that red line down there. So non-food inflation was not even going up to 25%. It has been below, you know, 20% up to last year. This year, I think first quarter, that's when it rose. But because food, in this case, if we are seeing the left graph, food contributes highly in that basket. So any fluctuations to prices of food also leaves a larger margin in the fluctuation of inflation. So the non-food is just the green part, and the discrepancy is that yellow. So if you can take the headline inflation year on year, you are just seeing that food inflation is the one which is contributing highly in this food measurements of the country. And if we want also to move forward, we can see, so all I'm just trying to say is, if the country just manages food, it means that our inflation could definitely go down, because non-food inflation was not rising much, and food inflation does not respond to the usual monetary policy. So non-food was actually contained by all other ways that were being done in terms of containing inflation. However, because food inflation does not fully get controlled by the monetary policy authorities, then this remained high, and it was actually influencing the larger part of the inflation in the country this year. And we also noted that I think the issues of exchange rate realignment has also contributed to pressure in terms of inflation, because the gave us a cost push inflation. For example, if you look at the graph to the left, this has been the changes in our currency, you know, the realignment that has been happening from 2022 April, where we had the 25%, and then we moved on up to 2023. Then the currency also depreciated slightly, as you can see on those steps there. And then we had the massive 44%, you know, exchange rate realignment. And even though we realigned, you can see that it also changed a little bit. You know, they're about around, I think, is it February, March, they're about. And if you can see that we were realigning, but this was not contributing much in terms of reserves that we are coming, because oftentimes we are told to realign so that maybe we make exports competitive, we push exports. But then as a country that is importing a lot, this has not helped us much, because it has actually brought a lot of imported inflation. Because the moment we have realigned the currency or the exchange rate, then it means that we've made the imports expensive while our exports are cheaper. And because of that, we were also widening the trade balance that I was showing initially in those graphs that I think I showed previously. And that meant that those who are bringing everything that is coming from outside into this country were supposed to put a higher markup so that they can make also profits. And that actually spurred up inflation more because of these realignment. And if we take the same story and we go to the black market, and we see that people are exchanging money on the black market, and if you just need the dollar, oftentimes those who have a lot of kwachas and they just want to clean up their money, they can demand